about tonight's message. It's cold outside, it's wet outside, yet it's still better than last week, So we just have to count our blessings. It's going to be good. Hey, we're continuing a series that we started at the beginning of this month called Out of Rest. And we've been looking at rest and what rest means and what's God's intention for us for rest. And we've kind of kicked off that series where we kind of talked about the principle and the rest that's fulfilled through Jesus. We look in the verse in Hebrews chapter 4 that talks about that there is a special rest for God's people, that we have a special rest that we can enter into. And man, the more I keep studying rest and Sabbath and these different concepts of rest found in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's just this concept that keeps getting deeper and more robust and more full. And what's interesting about all these things as we look at them, this rest, this idea of what we have, and this ability that as new covenant believers we have to work from a place of rest or live in a place of rest and be and create from a place of rest. All of that comes from the reality that our rest, our Sabbath, our ability to enter into relationship with God is not based on the very principle of our actions, but rather is based on the principle of Jesus' work at the cross. And so today, we're going to be continuing the same kind of the same kind of idea that we talked about this last weekend, which we looked at this concept of rest from the concept of work. What does work mean from rest? What does it mean to work from a place of rest? And this last weekend, if you missed it, we predominantly came from Genesis. We looked at Genesis chapter 2, specifically verse 15, that talks about that man was rested in the garden by God for two purposes: to both cultivate or to work or the land or the garden, and secondly, to tend or to take care of that creation. And so there's this double purpose. They were rested in this place with the purpose of cultivating this garden that was created by God out of a place of rest. And then secondly, tending, which the word that they use there is this priestly term, this word of co-reigning and co-tending with God, that there's this double portion of what they were called to do. And that we as humans are designed with this idea of work. We're designed with it in mind. We weren't designed to be creatures of inactivity. We were designed to be creatures of activity. But the real question that we get to ask ourselves is, from where does that activity flow? And the thing that we can see is in the beginning of Genesis, in God's original intention, this activity was supposed to flow out of a relationship of being with Him in the presence of a garden that we get to cultivate. And we weren't working to survive. We were working from a place of thriving in relationship with Him. But post-curse, we see this new principle of working to survive. One of the key parts of the curse was that you will live by the sweat of your brow. And that from dust you came and from dust you return. Literally this picture, this idea that we now have this life that has existed of working unto death. There's this whole other thing that you will work until you die. The only thing that will give you a reprieve from work is death itself, which is pretty demoralizing. That's not the funnest thing when you're especially I think the younger you are, the worse it is. When you're 20 years old and you're just really getting into the workforce, it's welcome to the workforce. You can do this until you die. That doesn't feel very good. I don't think I want to do that forever. So we have this idea, but I want to look at this now. And I could keep talking about Genesis because we could keep going, but I want to look at it through the New Testament perspective. But before I do, before I get into the New Testament, there's two things I want to look at. One of the things about Sabbath and about rest and this idea of coming from a place of rest that I want to just touch on real quickly before we jump into the New Testament and we look at Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the Sabbath. The idea of the Sabbath within the Jewish tradition is taking that one day, at sundown on Friday to sundown Saturday, taking that day and dedicating it to what the Bible says, holy things, dedicating it to time with the Lord, dedicating it to not working, dedicating it to rest and the provision that comes from that. And there's something about this idea that within this concept, there's an idea of addressing time. And time is this interesting beast. Time is a resource that we actually all possess in equal proportion. Everyone here comes from different backgrounds. Everyone here comes from different social, economic status. Everyone here has a different level of resources, whether it be money or relationships or family members or cars or house. Like, it's all different. But the one thing that we have in common is we all have the same amount of time. Time is this resource that is both finite, yet by the same token, infinite in our ability to perceive it. And time is this thing that is constant. And one of the things that is very uncomfortable for people to think about is time. I don't know how often you stop and think about time and what you use your time for, and how time just keeps going, and how we think about weird stats when you hear things like when they throw out like a third of your life is spent sleeping, and you're like, wow, that's not how I want to use a third of my life. Not sleeping. I have things I want to do, and that's just inactivity. Like and I don't know about you. I'm sure there's I know that there's Android users here, and maybe you have an Android equivalent, but okay, calm down. Oh, I shouldn't have started this fight. We'll pray for you. But my phone, for whatever reason, on the Lord's Day, Sunday, gives me a little weekly update of how much time I've been on my phone. Anyone else get the old update? And for whatever reason, it comes in the middle of worship every Sunday. I think it's the enemy trying to heap guilt and condemnation on me while I'm just trying to worship the Lord. And if it says hey, your usage was down this week, it's like, praise the Lord. Yes, God, I've been so good. You're a good Father. But when it's you've been up 72% or something crazy, it's like, forgive me, Lord. Sometimes we don't want to look at it. Some of you don't look at it because you don't actually want to see. And this is not a judgment. You don't want to see how much time you're spending on your phone. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying you don't want to look at it. You're just I'd prefer not to. I prefer not to know how long I spend on it. And we do that for a lot. I prefer not to know how long I have spent in my life watching TV. If there was a running tally and they could tell me right now, in your life you've spent this many hours, I don't want to know that number. I would be embarrassed by it. And I would then try to justify, but do you know how much of it was educational? There was education in some of that TV. Blue's Clues, Barney, all those things are very for my development. But time, we don't like to address time because one of the things is though in every day we have this infinite amount of time, we actually have no control of time. Time is not something that is controlled by us. We sometimes have the illusion that it is because in your phone you have a calendar app, and with that calendar app you're able to schedule appointments and meetings and different things, and so therefore you have this illusion that I'm very organized and I'm in control of my time. But the truth is you have no control over your time. None of us have control over our time. None of us know how much time we have here on earth, and also we cannot stop time. If you get behind, you cannot say, stop, time, stop. If we could, my wife would do it every day. If there was a real life time pause, my family would not move forward in time. We would be paused eternally. But we don't get to do that. We don't get to do that. And so therefore time, when we really look at it, which many times rest is associated with time, we don't want to walk in this idea because it makes us uncomfortable. And if we look at something where we pursue any kind of discipline, where we say we are going to take time in reflection, whether it's a day or whether it's a routine or whether it's whatever you land on in some of this journey, but we don't like this idea of time because when we reflect on time, sometimes it can make us uncomfortable. I want to read a quote to you from a guy named Abraham Joshua Heschel. Don't ask me why I was trying to say it in Spanish. I don't know, because his name's Joshua, but I literally was about to do some weird half Hebrew, half Spanish pronunciation. He wrote a book on the Sabbath, and he has a quote That's a pretty interesting quote about time specifically. I want to read it to you. It says, "We know what to do with space." Okay, the idea of space, like within your world, you have space, and you fill your space with things, like you have possessions, cars, ideas, clothes, like we have space. We're very space-oriented people. In fact, we can even, with our minds, interpret space and decorate space. Some of you are very, like my wife can like decorate a whole room in her mind. I could not ever do that in my whole life. But some of you are very gifted. Most of us don't know what to do about time. Most of us labor for the sake of recreating space. As a result, we suffer from a deeply rooted dread of time and stand aghast when compelled to look into its face. Time to us is sarcasm, a slick, treacherous monster with the jaws like a furnace, incinerating every moment of our lives. Shrinking, therefore, from facing time, we escape for the shelter to the things of our created space. And there's something about this quote that stands out to me, that sometimes when we're faced just with this moment, that this reality that in every moment we're passing from one moment of the present, and that moment is passing to the past, and we're stepping into this new level of the future, which becomes like this idea that time is constantly running. It can be an overwhelming trait, that time does not stop. And so therefore we would rather consume ourselves with the things that we have better control of than in sometimes wait. And that's hard because in the Bible is full of things that require waiting. There's so many stories in the Bible that really one of the big things in that story is waiting on the Lord. And that just means standing still. Sometimes it's for a moment, sometimes for a couple days, and sometimes it's for decades. This idea of just being still and allowing time to pass by. And the reason I'm talking about this whenever it comes down to work is so many times we don't like to allow ourselves to have free time, because it's in that free time that we can feel unproductive, and therefore we don't feel like we want to address the things that we need to address in time. But many times the thing that we need the most is we actually need to unschedule some things of this work nature to be able to deal with some things where we need to face the reality of time in our lives. And not the use of our time necessarily, but the reality that time is passing, and are we in a moment in which we are allowing God to speak to us in that time? That we're allowing God to move to us in that time. I was going to read this, I'm not going to do it tonight. I changed my mind. But if you want to have a fun read, go ahead and read Psalms 90. Psalms 90 is the only psalm written by Moses, and it has to do with right when the Ten Commandments were given, and he reflects not just on time, but he reflects on the failure of man and the result of what work looks like and the hope of work being restored. It's interesting, but I'm not going to talk about it. Sorry. We're going to spend the rest of our time in Matthew, because here's where I want to pick up. Matthew chapter 11 is where we're going to look at it. Jesus says some stuff that's crazy, and we have to put ourselves in the perspective of the time. Because Jesus, even when he announces his ministry to people, to like people of other religious things, we know that he went to the wedding at Cana, and we know he had the baptism. But when he announces his ministry, he just goes into this synagogue and he reads from Isaiah. And he reads actually our theme verse for the year that we have in our concept of restored vision. And that theme verse within Isaiah is actually speaking about the coming year of Jubilee, this ultimate, this rest of rest, this year of years, like this 7 times 7, this whole thing that we went to. So, but he announces this stuff, but he starts saying some things that can be, if we experience the same thing today, we would all be like, who is this guy? Because he goes into this synagogue in his hometown where people know him, and it's not very big. Nazareth at the time, most people believe, was about 1,000 people. And he goes in on the Sabbath, and he reads this verse in Isaiah, and then he says, afterwards, he folds it, he puts it down, and he says, all that has been fulfilled before you today in me. That would be the equivalent of us having some prophetic text that we all believe is going to happen someday, and me standing in front of you and reading it to you and saying, hey, that's all happened right here. How do you like me now? And you're like, we went to high school together, bro. Like, I know you. You can't be you. Like, you can't say that was you. You can't say that you're this new, the fulfillment of all this stuff. Jesus starts making these claims that people of the day, and by the way, he's not the first person in Jewish history to say that he was the Messiah. They had lots of people who said it. They all ended up dead, so it didn't work out very well for them. He wasn't the first one to say that. I mean, there's lots of people who said they were. Jewish tradition is full of these people who said that they were the Messiah or this or that, or they were the coming fulfillment or whatever, and they led this kind of little pseudo-Judaic cult, and then eventually, died. Bad for the brand. But Jesus starts saying some things, and one of the things he keeps addressing is he keeps addressing the Sabbath, this idea of rest. This idea of this day that's dedicated to this rest. This day that's a picture of the covenant of rest. And in Matthew 11, verse 25, he starts something interesting. Jesus is praying. And we don't know who he's praying in front of. We don't know what crowd's there. We just know that at some point he starts addressing the crowd. It says, at that time Jesus prayed this prayer. O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, thank you for hiding these things from those who think themselves wise and clever, and for revealing them to the childlike. Yes, Father, it pleased you to do it this way. At this point, he stops praying and he starts addressing whatever group of people is there. He says, my Father has entrusted everything to me. No one truly knows the Son except the Father, and no one truly knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Then Jesus said, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. There's so much in this passage, not just on the surface level. Like on the surface level, there's a lot, and we're going to look at it. We're going to break it down. But then there's some subsurface, some subcultural, some certain statements that are happening. First we can just look at this prayer. It's an interesting prayer. And again, if you read this in the context of, like, we know who Jesus is, and we believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So when we read Jesus, we're like, yeah, Jesus, tell him. But if you read this from like a third party, you may not actually like you may be like, who's this guy? Like, he says, verse 25, thank you for hiding these things from all these people who think they're smart. Everyone who's here who thought they were smart, thank you that you hid it from those smart people. That was so good of you, God. Like, if you were there, you'd probably be offended. Like, if I just told you, like, hey, all of you who think you're wise, God's going to hide everything from you, and it's only going to be the children that understand it. You probably wouldn't be like, thank you, that's good, I appreciate that. But that's what Jesus says. And he says, yeah, it pleased you to do it. And then he goes on and makes this statement that God entrusted everything to him. And this is actually one of my favorite verses in verse 27, because it says, no one truly knows the Son except the Father, and no one truly knows the Father except the Son, and to those whom the Son has chosen to reveal. This and a few other scriptures in the Gospels talks about how that if we want to understand the character of God and who God is and how God is and how God responds to certain needs, we can look at the life of Jesus. And the life of Jesus not only tells us the character of Jesus, but it literally tells us the character of the Father. It tells us who he is and how he works and how he operates. So there's this idea. But then we get to these 28 through 30, which is interesting, where he says, he invites people, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Now, the word rest here is not the word that would be considered a Sabbath rest. Of course, this is New Testament, so it's going to be written in Greek, but this is going to be the word that would be closer to the Old Testament word nuach, which is, it just means this rest from labor. He says, come to me and I will give you rest. And then he says an interesting phrase. He says, take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I'm humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. So we have this picture of this idea that take this yoke upon you. You guys, I'm sure most of you know what a yoke, but a yoke traditionally is made out of wood, and it's what joins two work animals together. And it's a double thing, because not only does it connect the two animals, but also distributes the weight and allows them to be able to tow or pull or whatever, a greater capacity. And so he's painting this picture that my yoke is going to bring you rest. I'm humble, I'm gentle at heart. You will find rest for your soul. So we have the second pronouncement of rest. And then in 30 it says, for my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. And it's interesting because, again, the very picture of a yoke is not that a yoke is necessarily lighter or heavier, but the yoke is what helps you be able to carry and move more stuff. Like, that's the whole purpose. Like, it's this idea, but Jesus is saying that his yoke is even lighter than the yoke that they already have. If you read in Jeremiah chapter 5 and chapter 6, part of Jeremiah's prophetic words that he speaks of for Israel says that they had broke the yoke of God because they were no longer following the covenant that they had with him. The yoke was broken. This idea, this partnership with God that they had entered into, this covenant was broken because they felt like they were no longer needed to apply those rules, and so they broke off that yoke. But one of the results of breaking off the yoke is you may think that your burden is lighter, but the reality is it becomes heavier because what you're pulling now is not distributed. It's really a matter of ergonomics. If you just have to carry a whole bunch of stuff, it's terrible. If you can put that same amount of weight in a backpack, it's better. If you can get one of those awesome hiking backpacks that has all the fancy straps and you can really, all of a sudden it's like, I don't even feel it. It's this great idea. There's this idea of this distributing weight. And so Jesus is saying, when you come to me, I can give you not only rest, but I can still allow you to work and to carry as much, if not more, than you could before. You can produce more. And not only is he saying that, you're now yoked to another person. You're yoked to another character. You're no longer yoked to something that's unnamed, because he doesn't say what you were yoked to. He says, now, when you come to me, you're yoked personally with me. And we get to carry that burden together. And we get to walk and to find true rest. This is where that picture, I did a series last year, but there's this picture where we see this character of Jesus, the ox, the one who carries your burden, the one who's the beast of burden, that he says that you can put your burden on him and he'll carry you and he will guide you. He is the elder ox that we get to be yoked to. And the result of that is us finding rest. But the picture is actually interesting because you only yoke animals when there's work to be done. You don't yoke oxen and then tell them to go graze. That's not the purpose. You yoke oxen when there's work to be done, when there's things to be pulled or fields to be plowed. You don't yoke oxen whenever there's nothing happening. That's not the purpose of a yoke. When they're not yoked, they can go off and they can do some things. And so we get again this picture of, I'm going to give you rest, but rest is going to be involved with work. Because I didn't just give you a green patch. You know what? Come to me and I'll take your yoke off and you can go graze. That's not what the verse says. Maybe that's what some of us wish it said. It's like, yes, Jesus, thank you for taking this burden off me, and now I can go graze and it'll be great. But he says, no. I'm just going to take you from an inefficient, heavy, burdensome, painful, non-productive work, which you are yoked to now. And instead, I'm going to yoke you to me, in which we are going to work together, and my burden is light, and the result will be rest for your soul. We see this same picture of the difference between the work that Adam and Eve were originally charged with, which was cultivating a garden in which everything was fruitful and multiplying around them, to the part where it says, by the sweat of your brow, you're going to have to work. We see this redemption of now it's more back to you're going to be working, you're going to be cultivating, you're going to be tilling this land, you're going to be working, but the difference is it will not be a work unto death. In fact, it'll be a work unto rest. It'll be a work into relationship with me. And for many of us, this is a foreign concept. If I told you today, hey, starting tomorrow, your hours at work are going to double, most of you would be like, no. Maybe some of you love your job and you're like, oh, yay, you're weird. The rest of us, me included, and I really like my job, would be like, double? Hey, I don't think I want to do that. I don't want to work more. Like that idea, this idea of more work is not good. But the principle that Jesus says is whether it's the same or more, he can give you something that results in a restful increase. God is a God of restful increase. Many times we just believe that God, just give me increase, whether it's in family or relationships or money or provision or whatever we talk about, we want this increase. But if you've ever received increase, sometimes increase is an increase. Sometimes you really want a promotion, and then you get the promotion, which is increase, and you're like, this is actually worse. This is worse. This is more stress. This is more problems. This is more frustration. Like, I thought increase was going to be better, but I keep increasing, and it actually gets worse. But we serve a God of restful increase. The God who can give you increase while giving you rest. That's not how the world gives. In fact, they give you the opposite. Like if you read any documentary, sometimes I'm a nerd and sometimes I listen to podcasts and watch educational documentaries. And there's this expectation, especially like in the corporate world, that the higher you get, the more you should be working, and that's just part of the job. I listened to this thing about this lady who was the CEO of Pepsi, brilliant lady, amazing, and she legitimately works between 16 and 20 hours every day, 6 days a week, and still works like 8 or 9 on the 7th day. That's her light day. And I remember I listened to the schedule. She gave her schedule. She gave her a whole day. And every day, and I remember thinking, there's no amount of money that I want to do that. She does not raise her own kids. She does not see her kids most days. She is gone before they wake up, and she is not home until they are in bed. Like 6 of the 7 days. That's how, she's like, I don't go to sports, I don't go to kids' things, but this is the responsibility I've been given because I've had this increase. And although I'm sure if we all saw her paycheck, we'd all say, well, maybe I'm doing for that much. Maybe. I mean, how long do I have to work? Just maybe a year or two. Then they could fire me and pay me that, big money severance, and I'd be okay. But the world does not give restful increase. They give increase with the expectation of more work, harder work. That's how the world gives. But God says, I don't give that way. I give you increase, but a restful increase. When my wife and I were pregnant with our second son, the thing that he spoke to us, the minute we were pregnant, as soon as we found out that we were pregnant, he said that this child will be your child of restful increase. And I didn't know what that meant. And did a lot of studying and I read about it. He's like, this will be, and I can tell you this, it came at a time and a season where we needed some rest in our lives. And that pregnancy was the easiest pregnancy of the 4. It was the easiest delivery of the 4. And in many ways, every child has their own thing. He's been the most restful of the 4. He learned to sleep the best. He took the naps the best. He still takes naps the best. He's the only introvert in our family. He'll just be like, hey, guys, it looks like everything's a little busy. I'm going to go ahead and go in here and just do my own thing so you guys can figure it out. Just shalom. It's who he is. There's this promise. And we didn't do anything different. This is just who he is. He was, but it was this principle. God said, I can increase you with rest. Whereas everything we heard is wait till you get 2 kids. Oh my Lord, 1 kid was hard, and then 2, then you can, then 3, then they outnumber you, and then 4, this whole thing. But God's like, no, I can increase in rest. And Jesus here is saying yoke yourself to me, join yourself to me. When you take on this burden, we're going to work together. Because an ox that sits around and does nothing is of no value to anyone. So we're going to work together. You're going to follow me. I'm going to show you what to do. We're going to work. But the result in your soul will be rest. And if you've ever been in a season when your soul cannot find rest, there is nothing greater than the promise of rest. When I was in a season in my life where rest was seemingly impossible to grasp, when God came and said, I will bring you rest within the process of you trusting and partnering with me in this work, it was amazing. Now, I want to be very clear. My work was not what gained me rest. My trust in Jesus is what brought rest into my heart. I didn't earn rest. That's not what it's saying. I didn't earn it like, God, I'm going to work really hard, and then you're going to gift me something. No. I said, I'm going to partner with you. And he said, you're going to partner with me, and I'm going to give you rest. It's very different. It's very different. And so he says this. He says, I'm this rest. And again, remember, he's in a culture of people who've been studying these laws for hundreds of years. And all of a sudden, he basically says, everyone that you thought you knew and everything you thought you knew about God, you were actually wrong. He hid himself from you. And I actually happen to know God, and I know everything about it. So in your face. And I'm actually the fulfillment of all those rules. And then he goes even harder. The very next verse, the very next chapter, it says, about that time, this is Matthew chapter 12. Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they began to break off some heads of grain, eating them. But some Pharisees saw them do it and protested, look, your disciples are breaking the law by harvesting the grain on the Sabbath. Again, I'd love to be there. I don't know if they're hiding in the grain field or if they're following them, or if it's a candid camera situation. But Jesus and his homies are just doing their thing. It's the Sabbath. They're walking around. They're hungry, and they decide to eat. And all of a sudden, ha-ha! Sabbath breaker. Which, by the way, it's actually even debatable on whether they were breaking the Sabbath. Because what they were trying to say is you were harvesting, which was against the Sabbath. Can't harvest. But the definition of harvest means you had to own the field, and therefore you have to harvest. They weren't actually harvesting. They didn't have it. There's also a caveat that said if you are poor, you can go and harvest the fields anytime you want. On the seventh year of the Sabbath rest, in fact, when you were not supposed to harvest the field, the poor were supposed to harvest the field even on the Sabbath. So these were a whole bunch of poor guys walking around. They could have just said, no, we have no food. So we harvest, fulfilling the Sabbath law. So this was really debatable. It was kind of ticky-tacky at best that they were trying to catch. But they were trying to catch him because he keeps on making these really big claims. So they said, we got you. You are harvesting on the Sabbath. Which, by the way, there's also, this is just a little nerd thought for you. Adam and Eve were told within the Sabbath rest of God, after God rested, and he rested them in the garden, he said, take and eat everything around you. Everything around you. And when they were with Jesus, Jesus says, I am, he's about to say it in a second, I am the Sabbath. He was in Sabbath, everything Jesus did was Sabbath. In Jesus' mind, everything he did was Sabbath. I am the fulfillment of Sabbath, so everything I'm doing is Sabbath. And so guess what? This is this mini throwback to the Garden of Eden. When they're with me, they see provision and they eat it. That's the result of hanging out with Jesus. There's provision. You're hungry, you eat it. So this is what he says. Verse 3, he says, haven't you read the script? Haven't you read the scriptures? Remember, he's not talking to some poor people. He's talking to the religious leaders, the ones whose whole job is to read the scriptures. And it's have you ever read the scriptures? That's offensive. If I was in a room of pastors and we were discussing something and I started off, my statement is, have you ever read the Bible? That's offensive. And Jesus meant it to be. Don't mess with Jesus. I didn't write it. I'm just telling you what it says. He says, haven't you ever read the scriptures? What David did when his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God, and he and his companions broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests were allowed to eat. Now, I'm going to read verse 5, but we're going to back up. Verse 5 says, haven't you read the law of Moses? Jeez, again. Haven't you read the law of Moses, you professional readers of the laws of Moses? Haven't you read it? That priest on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath? Hold on, before I keep going, I want to back up. Do you notice he says the thing about David and he doesn't give any explanation about it? Like, don't you remember when David and his guys were hungry? So they went to the temple and they went into the holy place and they ate the showbread? And he's like, yeah, don't you remember that? No explanation. They were not supposed to go in there, by the way. They were not allowed to go in there, by the way. That was for priests only. And it's still debated on whether priests were allowed to eat the bread, but they couldn't eat it until it was taken out, which means it'd be a week-old bread, which I don't think you want to eat that bread anyways. But when he went in, they were not supposed to go in there. When we would look at it, you say, oh, Jesus, they were actually breaking the rules. But Jesus is saying it when they were justified. Do you understand that they did that and they were justified in doing that? They didn't break the law when they did this? And we know it can't be that everything David did was okay, because we know the whole Bathsheba thing, so clearly he had some issues. But he said, David came in. No explanation. And whether it's because he knew they would understand or because he doesn't need to explain himself. Let me break down what he's saying. This happened when David was running from King Saul. This happened when David was now the anointed king of God, but there was a pretend king in the place. And when you were the king, not only was David the king, David had something else. He had this very different view. He had something that went back old school to almost how Moses led as well, even though Moses was a king. David was not only a king, but David was a king and a priest. That David led in priestly duties. That David was this foreshadow of Jesus who was going to come, who was not only going to be a king, but also a priest. That we not only have a king, but we also have a priest. And that we, in believers, are called as king priest within him. And so he's basically said, we had a king who was not the real king, who was flaunting around. But then there was this real king who came, who was anointed and was having to run and hide because people were persecuting him. And so that king priest with his men went into the holy place, which the whole tabernacle or the whole temple was a whole recreation of the garden. The whole thing is a recreation of the garden. Everything was that's why there's trees in there. That's why there's the olive branches. That's why there's the almond trees. That's why there's the whole thing is this recreation of this garden, the ability to enter into it. They went in, and he said, don't you understand they were able to go in because he was the anointed one. He was the king priest, and so he went in even though you didn't know he's the king priest. And him saying that in this rule, he's saying, don't you understand that I'm the anointed king that you haven't seen yet? There's a fake one running around, but I'm the real one, and me and my men just went through this field, and we could take it because this is who we are. We're the king priests. Don't you understand that when we are the king priest, the fulfillment of the Sabbath rest means that we can work with God within the Sabbath, and it's not breaking the Sabbath because we're working within the rest of who God is. And so therefore his provision is there, so we take and eat. I know it's a lot. I know you may think I'm crazy. Some of you are like, I don't know what this guy's talking about. But for those who do, which I hope is a majority of you. So then he goes on, after again saying hey, I'm your greatest, I'm the embodiment of your greatest king ever, David. Again, another big statement that Jesus is making right in these good Jewish boys' face. If I were to make myself a historical character, I would be David, your greatest king. Again, that'd be like me being I would be a combination of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and like me trying to this. And he said, haven't you read the law of Moses that the priest on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath? I tell you, there's one here who's even greater than the temple. Greater than the temple? The place where God's presence dwells? The place that was designed by David and implemented by his son? Greater than the temple? Jesus said that one who's greater than the temple is here, right in front of you. And I'm greater than the temple, because I am the embodiment of that temple and the embodiment of that rest. So therefore, everywhere I go is Sabbath. That Jesus was basically saying, every day I Sabbath. You just don't know what it looks like. And every day I work on the Sabbath. because my work's different than your work, because working in Sabbath rest with God is different than working by the sweat of your brow. But you would have not condemned my innocent disciples if you knew the meaning of the scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath. And this is the point where they just their whole brains explode. He's said way too many things that they're just like, this guy says he's David, and he's the temple, and he's the fulfillment of the law, and now he's the Sabbath, this guy said he's the Son of God, and he says that he knows God, he fulfilled, their whole brains are just completely warped at this point. It was basically around this time that they decided they had to kill him. For sure. He said, I'm the Lord, even over the Sabbath. Here's the whole thing that I want you to do. And I've just been rambling. I hope that you've gotten something out of it tonight. Here's the thing that we understand when we walk with Jesus. We understand that when we are yoked with him, there's no coincidence that he says, I'm the fulfillment of the Sabbath, that I know the Father, and that my Father's desire for you is that you have restful work from a place of rest, which comes when you partner with me. And when you partner with me, you then get adopted into my family. When you get adopted into my family, you then become members of my king priest crew. And we walk around living Sabbath life everywhere that we go. And yes, we work, but we work from a place of rest. And we see restful increase every moment of the day, because Jesus said, I am even the Lord over the Sabbath. And that it's not about a day. Man was not meant to keep the Sabbath. What Sabbath was meant to keep man. There's a result. You were meant to be kept by God and partner with him. His entire desire was to walk in this relationship with us where we could be co-laborers with him and also be king, priest, rulers with him, to rule and reign in partnership with him. You're not called to work by the sweat of your brow unto death anymore. You're not called to go into work every day and be miserable. You're not called to be stressed out and carrying the anxiety and the frustration and the problems and the health. We have so many health problems in our society that are due directly to stress and anxiousness, and so much of that is caused by work and provision and money and fear of not enough and all this idea. And God says that's not the path that we believers have. There is a special rest for you and for me. That's not about what we do, but rather who we do it with. It's not about do we keep a day or not keep a day or have a 24-hour. It's not about that. It's about who we partner our lives with. And as a result, you find rest in work. And you find provision that's greater than money. And you find increase that's full, not just with the thing that increase has, but with the unexpected outcome of what increase is. And church, my heart for you as we continue, this weekend I'm excited because this weekend we're going to talk about rest and health. And we're going to look at the 7 times that Jesus heals on the Sabbath. Rest and health. And again, not inactivity. It's going to be good. But church, I want us to be able to leave this place knowing God has something different for believers than what the world has, because the world is the world. We cannot forget that we live in a spiritual world. The world is cursed, and apart from Jesus, humanity is cursed, and the cursed ground results in working to death. And that's what we see in our society, and people are trying to figure it out, but that is what it is. Apart from Jesus, you cannot be separated from the curse. But with Jesus, you've been redeemed from the curse. With Jesus, you enter into a new covenant and the beginning of a new creation that God wants to establish inside of you. It's who you are. I'm out of time. Let me pray. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Lord, thank you for how deep and how rich and how powerful and how wonderful your word is. Lord, I pray for the people who are here tonight. Lord, I pray your Holy Spirit fills in all the gaps of my just talking and fills them with the truth and the connections and all the little things that make them personal towards us. And I pray that as we leave this place, we would be a church that's full of people who know that even in work we can find rest. Even in activity we find rest, not because of how good we are, but how good Jesus is and the partnership we have with him. We love you, Jesus. We're thankful we get to be co-laborers with you, that we be king priests with you. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.